Hello, everyone, and welcome to CI's webinar, Unpacking the Lag Between Organizations' Readiness to Securely Adopt AI, while their overall maturity and security posture is showing improvement year over year. So this session is based on CI's Global 2026 AI and Cyber Maturity Report. We will address some of the findings, but actually hear from our panel members how those findings actually come in practice, in reality, in their own environment. We will end up with some key actions and tips from our panel members. And the whole panel, this whole webinar will be for 40 minutes. We will leave some time for all our listeners. Thank you for joining us. We will leave some time for questions. If we have more questions left and we haven't answered your questions, don't worry, we will follow up with you following this webinar. And if your teams weren't able to join us, don't worry, we will share within 2 days, we will share also the recording of this live webinar so that you'll be able to share it with your teams and whoever is interested in the topic. I'm sure it will take a lot of interest. So with that, I'd like to start with introducing our panel members. I'd like to start with Craig McKeown. He's the Global Chief Information Security Officer of Dechra Pharmaceuticals. And he brings a rich perspective across high-stake industries, including pharma, telecom, and ICS, as well as his very rich military background in the British Army and Navy. So welcome, Craig. Thank you for joining us. Next is Reuven Aronashvili. He's a founder and CEO of CI, and bringing his diverse expertise in high-pressure leadership, serving hundreds of large enterprises across industries and globally. So welcome, Rubi. And lastly, Dr. Nimrod Partush, the Chief AI and Innovation at CI. And Nimrod Partush actually brings this very unique perspective of AI, deep learning, and code analysis combined with hands-on years of experience in offensive and defensive cyber intelligence. So welcome, Nimrod, welcome, Craig, welcome, Rubi, and welcome to all our listeners. We hope we will make this as valuable and interesting as possible. So let's start with AI. As we said, this is about really understanding the lag between enterprises' adoption of AI across their organization and their readiness to actually adopt it securely. And what we're seeing when we look at the market and the adoption of AI across enterprises, we see essentially that AI has become the most adopted software category in history, with the fastest adoption reach ever. So within 3 years, AI has been adopted in enterprises to the level that SaaS was adopted in 10 years. So with that, when we look at how many organizations worldwide adopted AI, it's almost 9 out of 10. The flip side of it is that it also has been weaponized by attackers in a 90x fold multiple. So the question that I'd like to pose here first for our panel members is, when you look at this rate of adoption, both by enterprises and by attackers, what would you categorize AI as? Is it a revolution or an evolution? And Rubi, can you please start us off? What is your perspective?
Of course. So, that's a very interesting question, because when you think about it, we started with talking about machine learning and then deep learning and machine-based decision making a long time ago. Now, everyone is talking about AI adoption in 3 years. To be honest, I'm not sure that that's true, because we started with these kind of capabilities a long time ago. But at some point, right, AI became the thing. It started with generative AI and then with agentic AI. And at this point, I truly believe that this is not an evolution, but really a revolution, and I'll explain why. I really think that there are some historical moments in our career path that you see things changing. You're saying, okay, that's not just an evolution. It's really changing a lot. And let me give you some examples, right? The revolution, for example, in vulnerability identification, right? Everyone is talking about Mythos, right? A very hot topic. I mean, I don't think that I've seen a lot of discussions lately that didn't mention Mythos. Now, of course, Mythos is just an example. There are similar capabilities, let's say, already available, for example, in the Chinese market or Asian market in general. I don't know, models like Kimi and similar are very powerful and out there. And we see actually that the speed, velocity, and capability is really changing, not only in the way that it impacts organizations, that means how fast things are being identified, it's actually being utilized also in the offensive world in a way that is, let's say, faster or much faster, unfortunately, than we as defenders actually adopt the capabilities. Now, when it comes to, I don't tend to start these kind of conversations in a negative way. So people are asking me quite a lot, right? So what can we do about it, right? It's really changing the equation, and there is really nothing similar on the defensive side to really protect against it. So I will say something that I'm quite consistent with, and that's something I'm saying for a very long time. If you stick to the basics, to start with, philosophy-wise, strategy-wise, we'll talk about the tactics in a second, but philosophy-wise, if you are going and dealing with the basics, hygiene, patch management, account management, MFA to different access, leaving nothing open that things that don't supposed to be there. You actually block them. Even in the Mythos area, you'll be okay. Now, there is a gap that we'll talk about also later, of exploitability gap, that the velocity of mitigation or remediation and velocity of exploitation, those are not going the same way. Exploitation is going exponentially. Mitigation is still linear, unfortunately, but that's something that we can definitely fix. How? We'll speak about it in a second.
Okay, so a revolution by Rubi. Craig, how do you see it impacting organizations, and specifically also Dechra? Is this a revolution in the enterprise?
It is interesting. If you'd asked me before, listen to Ruby, I would have spoken about evolution, but I can see where the idea of revolution comes. Like, I think AI, it is a revolution, and it's a step change. And there is an evolution as well. There is part of it. And Ruby, you sort of likened it to vulnerability management and things. The key thing is that the fundamentals still matter. Asset visibility, identity, vulnerability management, data protection, third-party risk, user awareness. AI hasn't changed any of those foundational things. They are still true, and they still have to be a priority for the CISO, for any of the teams that manage them. What AI has changed is the speed and the scale of the threat, and possibly more worryingly, the accessibility of the threat. So we've completely lowered the bar, because now AI can talk you on through an attack, which is both very impressive but frightening. So for us, that means not replacing the basics, but making sure that they're more measurable. So we need to understand the basics and how we measure them to ensure that we're compliant with the standards that we set. Automation is the biggest one that we need to focus on. So automating those basics wherever we can. And then over the top of that, the governance model becomes more and more important. So actually, whilst AI is facilitating very kinetic attacks, governance becomes even more important, because you need that governance layer to be super laser beam focused on the threat. So the key shift is moving from policy and intent to those practical controls, knowing where AI is being used, what data it can access, how vendors are using it, whether our existing cyber controls are keeping pace. And from that perspective, if I link it to the SOAR, and Ruby spoke about machine learning and ML and those type of things that have been around for a long time now, and some of the difficulties has been programming the logic in platforms like a SOAR to be effective. Where AI really comes in is giving us that sort of support to be able to make sense of how we want to put governance across things. So it does become an enabler, but again, it's an enabler of existing things that sit within a security operations function. So it is fascinating what's happening out there, but I think a CISO has to be grounded that actually the foundations are still very, very critical to a successful security organization. And if you get sidetracked from them and don't look at how you can integrate AI within them, then you're probably going to leave yourself with a huge gaping hole down the line.
Got it. So essentially, you are also answering, it is a revolution, but it requires a lot of the automation and the practical governance as well as practicality. We'll get into that in a more deeper level soon. Nimrod, following those two gentlemen, how do you define it? You decided also to call it out in the annual Global Maturity Report, addressing specifically AI maturity.
Yes, so I guess a bit of a spoiler with focusing an entire report partially with AI adding it to the headline. It is indeed a revolution. It's not something that we can ignore, and that is part of the reason why we headlined it and we performed this analysis. Also from the standpoint of an AI-based maturity framework, extending the one that we're already doing. This is something, this is such a big transformative change that using data as a tool to analyze it and identify whether organizations are ready for it. It's a very powerful and crucial tool because the sprawl is happening. AI is being adapted by almost every organization. Some of them are very highly adapting it, some a bit less, but it's here to stay, and it's a revolution that we have to put the spotlight on with our data in order to help identify and understand what's going on, what are the gaps, where is this going, is this what should we be doing about that, and taking this data and identify and translating it into risks. That's actually something very, very important, very crucial if you're talking about quantifying risk. So I can show for a second, if I can have the screen here, can actually show for a second how we can translate. Yeah, can I share? Oh, here, got it. Great, great. Just a second. Okay, here we go. Great. So we're talking about translating maturity into risk. So if we look at some threat paths, some risk paths that here we go, that say starts off from a Prometheus grade external attacker, and we want to understand how maturity impacts this. So say for example, we're talking about this attacker actually taking advantage of poor AI SDLC and reaching the capability of doing an RCE, an internet-facing web app. Now, this is the problem, right? Because the organizations now having all of these internet-facing assets, they're exposed to all these meters grade attackers. They're scanning it, they're identifying vulnerabilities, and they don't really know. These are 0 days. They don't know what are the problems. So they need to do the work beforehand and do an AI SDLC and do the scanning themselves with their AI capabilities in order to mitigate that. But let's say that for this organization it did not happen, and then we can go ahead and say match this whole risk path of having inadequate segregation, leading the attacker to an RC on a database. And here the problems are like very scary, right? You can have, if you don't have enough monitoring, it could affect your business continuity. And if you don't have DLP, then you have PII leaking, which is very substantial. Using maturity, we can identify, for example, if we look at this category here of maturity, we know that SDLC is mapped to it. So if an organization is performing very poorly in maturity for this, then we know that we can increase the probability of exploit here, and basically identify that these risks have become much more relevant. Of course, each attacker by itself each threat has their own risk, and the meters grade attacker is becoming something of a very high probability. Just like throwing it out there here, I don't remember the actual numbers, but this is key, the ability to use the information that we found in our analysis and then map it to probabilities and findings and risks. That's a very important and crucial ability of factoring maturity into this entire story. Here, for example, we can look at the detect function and see how it affects monitoring and so on and so forth. So just to bring it all home, focusing on AI is crucial because it's sprawling out there, and using it in order to gather insights is very important.
Thank you, Nimrod. I think what you actually shared with us is very clearly how this risk comes into practice. And if we think of what we are seeing in terms of the statistics of you shared with us essentially how I'm just trying
how the threat model, the exposure model works. Yeah.
How it actually comes into practice when it's exploited, when the different risks are exploited within an environment. But when we look at the AI risk, so if organizations adopt it, there's obviously the risk you shared with us, one risk of being exploited, not one, of the risk of AI being exploited in the environment. But the issue here, when we look at the different statistics that we see, and in 2025, a lot of us talked about how Gen AI is being used in phishing attacks and increasing the success of phishing attacks. When we look at the findings also that we found in the report itself, is the fact that there is more emphasis on governance, and yet still the unsanctioned AI, or what we don't know, the use of AI, the shadow AI that is very quickly replacing shadow IT, is becoming a key risk driver. So this is really a question around what is driving the biggest risk of AI within enterprises. And perhaps, Craig, you can start us off here with saying, explaining how you see this risk of AI broken down into Gen AI social engineering, shadow AI, maybe AI also in the SBOM, or AI actually in the code production.
It's fascinating looking at that slide, actually. When you think about it, there's only one, and that's the developer side, that I feel is relatively new. The rest, again, going back to the previous point, it's the same old stuff. Shadow AI. Well, we've had shadow cloud, shadow IT. there's a wider governance issue in the shadow front that I don't think is just the purview of AI. But it's interesting in terms of the ranking of those risks. I'd rank them slightly differently depending on whether we're looking at likelihood or impact. I'm hoping my head of GRC is listening to this so she can see that I listen to her and I understand likelihood and impact. But that aside, I think, in terms of likelihood, shadow AI and Gen AI enabled sort of social engineering attacks in particular, they're probably the most immediate concerns. So shadow AI is so expansive. When you think about it, yes, there's the use of LLM. So do I block someone accessing Claude, for example? But then you get into the deep and wonderful world of all the extensions and plugins that users may be able to put into, say, Outlook, that may leverage an AI platform that the user is unaware of. And it just comes into your environment. Suddenly, it can have quite expansive accesses within someone's mailbox, as an example. And that is, it's a bit of a headache, that one, if I'm being completely honest. And that they're happening inside organizations. If you think about it, not most, but lots of people are now, they're getting things like Copilot Foundry licenses, Copilot Studio licenses, sorry. And the idea of the developer is rapidly changing. There was a time where a developer was a guy or a girl who usually had a slightly better spec device, and we put our arms around them a little bit more tightly from security because we knew they were doing sensitive stuff, and they do that stuff in dev environments, and if we got it right, they do it in a secure way. Now, though, people can build agents and have them running in prods, and in most organizations in a completely uncontrolled manner, which is fantastic for productivity. I mean, I don't think we can underestimate the positive impact that AI is going to bring to the workplace. But from a security perspective, it is a headache, and the last thing that security wants to be is the fun police who stops people making these agents to help them with the work, right? So it's a bit of a wicked challenge in that sense. Because these things are what we're talking about, especially that sort of shadow AI. This is happening now. This isn't what's coming down the line. This is a relevant problem at this point in time. If I think about impact, though, if we go away from that sort of likelihood aspect, the impact, then supply chain AI, and for me, there's one that I really get on my soapbox about, is AI in code production. Really, really worry me. There's some fascinating studies and articles where devs are using plugins and agents to support their coding efforts. And again, that is absolutely fantastic. That particular use case is so positive. But when they're getting something from Google Store, for example, they have no idea if that plugin, that agent is safe. And it's not just is safe at the point of time they're deploying it, because there's a really fascinating article that I've read recently where agents that were safe then become unsafe later on down the line when somebody does something with them. So you've got that life cycle of, is that particular thing safe for those developers? And the idea that malicious code could be injected into one of our applications that we've made is such a difficult thing to guard against, so difficult. And yet, again, devs are absolutely running at speed, using and leveraging AI capabilities to help them with their coding efforts. So it's a real wicked problem. So, I want to be clear, despite saying all that the practical answer is not to stop adoption. I absolutely don't think that's the right thing. I think any security organization that does that potentially will put itself at loggerheads with the business, but it's to make it visible. And again, we're back to basics. Visibility is key, whether it's visibility of your servers, your endpoints, or your bill of materials that leverages AI capabilities, be it internal or external, where they're calling on external AI agents to support them. They need to be governed. Again, we're back to that governance point, and it needs to be risk assessed. So we need to be clear what we're doing and what sort of risk we perceive from AI capabilities, and with clear routes for colleagues to use AI safely. So as an example, we have a questionnaire where anybody wants to bring in an AI platform or a platform that leverages AI. There's questions, and the first low-level question is very simple. If it's an expansive AI capability, then there are more challenging questions, but that allows us to assess the risk and understand what the risk is to the business, not to stop things coming in, but to then allow us to put compensating controls around something to make sure that we protect the business as much as possible. But I think, you know, if you go back to that adoption slide at the start, Daniela, one of the biggest challenges is security teams keeping pace with this rate of adoption. We've struggled with every other big wave, the idea of bringing endpoints and servers into sort of EDR, NDR, and XDR capabilities, OT, operational technology, then cloud technologies. I don't know many organizations who have had security teams that have kept pace with that rate of change, and yet AI makes those change paces look so slow. So it is a real wicked problem of how does security keep pace, a real challenge.
Yeah, it's and especially when you say keep pace, especially when the attackers are just increasing their pace. This is something that also will be mentioned right in the beginning about the growing exploitability gap. So it's not just AI, but now also with LLMs introducing much faster discovery of vulnerabilities in code with a great velocity that we haven't seen before. And so, Rubi, when you see this great pace, and you addressed before also the fact that also defenders can use AI to defend, but still, what is required apart from, let's say everything is good and we have visibility, what else is required for defenders to protect the organization safely? As Craig said, we can't stop it. So what is needed to be done?
So that's a very good question. I think that you know, the visibility part, that was the bottleneck in the past, right? You think about how do you identify your situation. That's something that might be easier or is easier today using the tools, and will be probably much easier in the future, right? So that's something that we need to understand, that getting initial visibility into where vulnerabilities are, that's something that might be a solved problem in a way, right? Of course, with time, I guess it will have a price tag associated with it, but it's there. Now, what you do with the information, from my point of view, is really the game changer. Meaning, taking the information, putting the information into a structured, contextual approach, right? And to me, that's key, context, right? We'll talk about it also later. Having the organizational context connected to the threat profile of the potential attackers, and in the end to the organizational assets, and then you can actually understand, hey, if I have those vulnerabilities, the impact that I'm going to have is this one, then it's very logical to go and prioritize, which again, this is another key capability that you need to have, prioritization. If we understand that we cannot mitigate everything, the one thing that we need to do is try to get those two graphs that you're now showing on the screen as closer as possible to each other. One way is to stop the offensive activities, but we see that that's not going to happen, right? So it's going to grow exponentially. So we need to be able to stick with that and understand which of the vulnerabilities that we've identified are actually starting with exploitable, and second, will actually move the needle. Because if you have the context associated with it and you're able then to prioritize, then those graphs will be very much alike, because you remove the exponential growth of a lot of noise, and being able to cut through the noise and get to what really matters most. That's really, from my point of view, one of the most important things to be able to do. If you add to that the option to add responsible, supervised, automated remediation, then you're getting to a cycle that allows you really to act much faster. Because again, we said it before, the gap now is velocity, right? Because the time to exploit, mean time to exploit, went down. It's not that the techniques or concepts are changed, it's just they are doing that much faster. So be able to identify what's important, cut through the noise, do that with the relevant organizational context, and automate the remediation in a responsible way. Again, I want to be very clear about it, because we don't want to create the next operational issue, right? Because attackers may be left out. But if we are breaking our environment every Tuesday based on automated remediation, we have a different problem here. So of course, we need to do that in a responsible way. But from my point of view, prioritization is and will be key in the future.
Yep. Thank you for that. So let's shift now to the next part. And there are two clear findings that we saw, like a dissonance and lagging variance between governance of AI, introducing policies, as well as the lagging in the actual management of it. So putting the governance and the policy in effect, in action, in organizations. If I move on to another key finding, it was around also the variance and the difference between different vertical industries, where we saw a tremendous gap between what we call the more, I would say, critical infrastructure, whether it's transportation, energy, healthcare, where we saw evidence of the use of AI. There probably also was a policy in play, but the management and the actual tooling to manage the use of AI was lacking. And so this is a question to you, Nimrod. When you look at these differences between the sectors and the lag between governance and actually management of AI risk, how do you explain this huge discrepancy in AI risk between the industries?
Yes, definitely. So I'll start with the gap between governance and the actual execution. So governance is it's like a politician, right? You always you always want to say that's the easiest thing. Like that's the first thing you want to say. We're going to fix it. We'll do it. It will be great. Will be amazing. Will be tremendous. If to quote someone. So saying it is sometimes the easiest part. And I've seen organizations, officiate a governance committee and start talk about AI governance, and really saying all the words and drafting out policies. That's happening a lot, and that's I think that's the easy part of things. But when it comes to to actual execution, that's where you see the gap, and there is a big gap. We've seen it in the report, and we're seeing it all around. I think that when we look at the question whether creating policies may create a false sense of security, that's definitely might be the case. So when these organizations go about and treat the governance problem, then they should remember that that's not enough. And when we're talking about differences between sectors, so I think that's a question of the type of the sector, and really, do they have the luxury of waiting and doing a more controlled transitions? For instance, if we talk about the banking industry, I have a friend who works in banking. He's a product manager there, and he told me that the product managers are actually not allowed to use AI in their line of work, which was very, very surprising for me. I thought, how can you manage? How can you just stay behind? But I understand that for those types of companies and organizations, there is much more regulation. They need to be careful, but they also have the luxury to move slowly because the entire sector moves more slowly, and they don't have this big problem of keeping a technological edge. So for those type of sectors, they can move more slowly, but there are other sectors, of course, like tech sectors, etc., where they can't afford to wait and stay behind. So I think that really speaks to the to the gaps that we're seeing in these results.
That makes a lot of sense. And Craig, if I direct this question also to you, based on your diverse experience, pharma now, beforehand telecom, and also in consumer packaging, and also in critical industrial control systems with Anglo American, how do you see the differences between the sectors?
I mean, it's a good question, right? It does vary, and I think this is a continuation of that variance across, again, cloud infrastructure. So it does vary by sector. I must admit that the graph did catch me a bit by surprise, but I'm not surprised by the rankings. That does sort of make sense in my mind. I think the underlying issue is often less about intent from the organization or more about complexity. What I mean by that, if you think in sectors like pharmaceuticals, healthcare, manufacturing, transport, you have a real broad mix of corporate IT, operational technology, so that's in the factories or the mine sites, so that manufacturing site. In the pharma, you've got regulated systems, so under GXP, and then typically, and more so in the sort of factories in that operational technology space, real legacy systems, and frustratingly, third parties that directly connect into some of those systems because they're black box proprietary things that we can't do anything with. So I think that complexity is maybe a little bit less so in some of those lower ranked sectors because they just don't have that legacy spread of stuff. And what that does, of course, is it creates more places where AI can be adopted or hidden, if we talk about the shadow side, embedded or even indirectly introduced through especially those third parties. Especially in manufacturing, there's obviously a huge interest in efficiencies in the manufacturing space. And when a third party offers to help you become more efficient with their black box solution, does it have AI that's being leveraged out that? Probably yes, because why wouldn't you? But is that being brought to us up front? Are we really aware of what they're doing in the background, most importantly with our data? And then when you take that and think of, if you compare that to somewhere like financial services, which whilst they've maybe got cash machines, which have Windows XP or something, they tend to have much neater control environments, usually because of regulation and regulatory pressures. Funding and cyber risk management as well. It's not because they do funding and cyber risk management better, but finance has been at this game a lot longer than some other sectors. So because of that regulatory pressure, finance has been involved in cyber more deeply for a longer period of time. So that maturity curve has had longer to start to grow. So the lessons for other sectors is not simply about copying financial services. I don't think it's that at all. It's to bring that same discipline. But again, and there's a theme that I'm going to keep coming up with, I guess, to visibility, to governance, to control testing and productization, especially where operational resilience and in Dechra's case, patient and customer or product safety is involved. And so having solutions that allow us to do that, to have that visibility, to apply that governance, because governance is getting harder. You've got NIST 2, you've got DORA, you've got the UK equivalent coming, you've got CES and fiscal side, you've got all these regulatory things appearing, and they're helpful because they help us have a structured conversation with our executive teams like finance has had for a number of years now. But trying to keep track and measure yourself against all those different regulatory or sort of nation state requirements takes a lot of work. So having for us having platforms that allow us to do that tracking that can be automated are really important for us. But yeah, there's definitely a difference, and it's part of what makes manufacturing interesting, whether it's mining, fast moving consumer goods, pharma, is the complexity of the estates that you find yourself working with, because it's often weird and wonderful. Often a lot of companies, especially manufacturing, have come from a series of acquisitions, so none of it aligns to any other site. It's all different sites doing different things. So it's a nice complex problem for us to try and address. But in terms of what I've seen, then yes, that there is quite a pronounced difference, and some sectors have it easier where they can use regulatory sticks to get what they need. Other areas, like mining, for example, it's a little bit more difficult because you've got less of that regulatory support to justify what you're trying to do. In those cases, that's where that risk management lens becomes super important, because you use business risk as a vehicle, right?
Right.
I do want to address one thing that Craig said. I was also caught by surprise by this slide, I have to say, when I created it. But when I thought about it, this talks about shadow AI. Basically, users are using AI and you're not seeing it. And the way, what I found was, to explain it, was that when we're talking about highly tech savvy plus regulated industries, sectors, they're just great at really, keeping everything in line and also using the tech to find it. And we're talking about less regulated or less tech savvy sectors, for instance, like transportation. Then there you may have more sprawl, because you need to remember that users, humans, got this AI in their hands and they're just aching to use it in wherever they can. Even if it's not 100% approved. So that's my take on that.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And this actually takes us to our very last closing question. It's a very quick question, and it's really based on your learnings. There is one thing that came out very starkly in the report, where when comparing cybersecurity maturity overall based on NIST CSF 2.0 and AI RMF, AI maturity, there is a clear dissonance between this, the fact that we've seen over the past year an improvement in security posture and cyber maturity. However, the AI maturity is actually relatively very low. And so this gap is something that came out very, very clearly. And my question to you is, if you have to look internally, what is this, let's say, one tip that you can, or one piece of advice you can provide our listeners to focus on as a practical action they can take after this webinar into their own organizations? And perhaps, Craig, you can start us off, and then Nimrod and Rubi.
Yeah, sure, Daniel. Again, it's probably going to sound like a broken record now, so I apologize to everyone who's listening. But my main takeaway is that AI, it doesn't change the need for strong cyber fundamentals, but it does raise the bar in execution. So getting it right, and getting it right first time, you need the visibility of assets, identities, data, vendors, emerging technology. None of that has changed. It's still true as it was before AI, as it is now. But you need governance that is practical enough for the business to follow, and you need prioritization that focuses investment on the risks that matter most. So, if I take Dechra, for example, the emphasis has been on building a stronger foundation, improving that visibility, improving our vulnerability management, our governance, and our incident readiness, also creating a control path for responsible AI adoption. The biggest risk, I think, would be treating AI as either purely a technology opportunity or purely a cyber threat. It's both, really. So security needs to enable, it safely rather than simply block it. So, my key takeaway is don't go away from the foundations, but find ways to obviously expedite your work in those foundations, and most importantly, targeting the right things. So, that's where good governance and risk management becomes ever more important, because that will give you the knowledge, the information of what is the right thing to go after. I think the days of playing whack-a-mole is probably out there. We need to become more like snipers.
Nice. Nimrod?
Yeah, so adding on what Craig said, those basics, a few tips. I think giving AI risk a named owner in the organization is always a good idea. And don't just form a committee, because if everyone owns it, then no one owns it. So you want something similar to the CISO effect. Focus on the beginning of it, the access control, the AI safety, and make sure that you treat that you extend vendor risk both to AI as well, because that is definitely a risk, both operational and a cybersecurity one, that you need to address it as such. And everyone wants to scale AI, so the approach should be to monitor it on a lower scale before you scale it up. Identify where your model is drifting, if you have problems with your integrity, if you can get injected into your prompt, and eventually, don't just document the gaps, address it, do real-time scenarios and testing and exercises to see that you really are able to execute on your policy, because we see that those rehearsals really get teams to a higher level.
Thank you. And Rubi?
Yeah, so first of all, I agree with everything that was said, and I can echo back the thing about back to the foundations, right? That's one of the most important things. To add on what was said by Craig and Nimrod, I would say that there are two other things that are very important to mention. First, and that's something that I don't say a lot, but maybe it's time to think about it, and that's minimizing the attack surface. That's something that will be very valuable. And when I'm saying the attack surface, let me give you an example. One thing that we see in a lot of organizations is that we get into the organization, we find that, for example, they are storing data for the last 10 years, right? The data that is being used practically is the data maybe of the last 6 months. So you have around 90% of data, if that's linearly divided or distributed, that is just sitting there, and it's just a target. If that's something that you put as archive, encrypt it, and then next time that you need to use it, so yeah, maybe you need another second factor in order to get access to the data, that's okay, because the usage there is not that often. So minimizing not only the attack surface from the incoming approach, like in internet attack surface or something similar, but also the impact surface, right? That's something that I would highly recommend organizations to start putting away. Everything that doesn't need to be there, clean it up. Clean desktop, right? That's the approach that we're taking here. Second is everything that we are doing, including basic foundations, including the exercises that Nimrod mentioned, and above all, context management in the organization has to be first continuous. So point-in-time approach in general won't be effective in these cases. And second, maybe the most important thing, it has to be dynamic, meaning you have to adopt your tactical approach, maybe not the strategy, but the tactical approach whenever something happens in the industry. And that's something that I would say would definitely, with the things that the educated colleagues here just mentioned together, this is a very powerful, let's say, do's and don'ts in your environment that can really help us win in this very interesting battle.
Thank you, Rubi. So as we close, I think it's very apparent that you all agreed it's a revolution. You all also agreed that we still need to focus on foundations and basics, but the approach has to be slightly different to address the pace, because it's still a revolution. There is a very clear need to be, as Craig, you said, be a sniper, not just a whack-a-mole. So sniper meaning accurate, precise with actions. Nimrod, you said it's also about making it responsible and safe to implement AI and also to rehearse it. And Rubi, the minimization of attack surface and also minimizing the impact surface, which enables really this continuous action with the context and with a dynamic environment, could really help us mature the organization completely also into the AI world. So thank you very much for that. This is really the closing of our webinar. We will share the recording with all you listeners. Thank you for joining us. We will follow up with you, and we got some questions. We will share the answers for those questions over email with all of you. and we appreciate you joining us. So thank you and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Pleasure. Thanks, Daniela.